Hey, this is Bree, and this is my second journal article in my presentation on it. So, the title of my article was Why Not Ask Them? A Systematic Scoping Review of Research on Dyadic Teacher Student Relationships as Perceived by Students with Emotional and Behavioral Problems. We had several authors. This was a German team that put this together. I'm not going to go through all the names, but it was a substantial amount of researchers. General summary. So, over the years, the studies on the student teacher relationships involving students with emotional or behavioral problems have been insufficiently assessed. Although each study has been independently successful, the broader questions have been left unanswered. The researchers of this article worked to compile the most influential and relevant articles regarding STRs, student teacher relationships, with EBPs, emotional and behavioral problems, and answer foundational questions for future studies. Additionally, they sought to find answers from the perspective of the students rather than the teachers. On the side here, we just have a little key: STRs, student teacher relationships, and EBPs, emotional and behavioral problems. That's what I will refer to them for the rest of the presentation. Author perspective. So, although the authors strove to keep a neutral, distant tone throughout their research, I could detect their skepticism and doubts. Very validly so, as this was their three goals. So, number one, they wanted to make sure that future research on STRs with EBPs would have a clearer foundation to build upon. All these individual studies got results for what they were looking for. However, the foundational questions were still left unanswered, and many researchers were simply inferring from previous articles and not actually finding out the answers. So this is what this whole study was about. Secondly, many of the studies had neglected to account for key variables that had influenced the interpretation of the results. So once again, inferring rather than having solid answers. And lastly, there was very limited research from the student's perspective. Many of the studies had asked questions to the teachers involved in these relationships and neglected to ask the students. And many times, what actually was discovered was that the teachers had a more negative outlook towards the relationships than the students did, which was interesting because the students are the reason for these relationships, and it's important to receive their feedback as well. And it was interesting to discover that the teachers had a more negative outlook while the students were actually benefiting more than the teachers believed that the students were benefiting. Personal perspectives. I was delighted to know that the study's purpose was to fill in the holes of the bigger picture. This is more of a personal pet peeve, but I am very disappointed when research is not backed by solid research. And I was excited to know that this was a study to compile previous studies and make sure that future research had solid grounds to continue on. And then secondly, I learned a lot about modeling healthy relationships and continuous education. I think this is a pattern that I also discovered in my previous article, was how important it is for healthy modeling from the teacher and the student, not only for the students within these STRs, but for the students around them watching. Having a good and healthy model, an example to look up to, is so important, and the research has shown that. So, what are the implications for educators? One of the biggest problems that these STRs were facing was the tendency of them to become codependent and unhealthy. The students with EBPs already struggled with creating healthy relationships, and so instead of the teachers trying to model that within their personal STRs, when it became codependent and unhealthy, the entire purpose was defeated. So, as educators, how can we pivot STRs away from becoming codependent and unhealthy? Secondly, direct intervention and coaching during particularly difficult situations. Tackle the problem right then and there, address it. Don't shove it under the carpet and wait for it to surface again as a bigger problem. Thirdly, realistic expectations for such relationships. Once again, going back to the negative perspective that teachers had on the STRs, I think a lot of it came from the unrealistic expectations that they had for their relationships and where it was going to go from there. And then lastly, this is just basic, but having ample instruction for the teachers involved in STRs and making sure that the teachers themselves are also supported throughout the process. And then this is my references. So, yeah, thank you for listening.